Part 4. Here the main arguments offered by Arminians, in support and defense of their views on liberty, moral agency, and similar topics, and in opposition to the contrary doctrine, are examined. Section 1. The true character of virtue and vice in the inclinations of the heart and the actions of the will does not rest in what produces them, but rather in their very nature. If we look closely at the arguments that defend these modern ideas of liberty, virtue, and vice, we find that they rest on a fundamental assumption, namely, that the moral worth or guilt of our heart's dispositions or the acts of our will does not lie in what those dispositions or acts truly are, but only in what caused them. According to this view, no matter how good a disposition or act may be, if its cause is not our own virtue, then it has no moral value or praiseworthiness. Conversely, even if our will is inclined toward what is evil, unless that evil comes from something that is our own fault, there is nothing truly blameworthy about it. This idea forms the backbone of their principal objection, a supposed self-evident truth, that there can be no real virtue or vice in any habit or act of the will unless it springs from a prior virtuous or vicious choice of the will itself. But upon reflection, this is not merely a mistake, it is a profound absurdity. It is absolutely clear that if there is such a thing as a virtuous or vicious disposition or act of will, its moral character is found not in what caused it, but in what it actually is. If the essence of virtue or fault does not rest in the very nature of a disposition or act, but only in its cause, then in truth, virtue or vice cannot be found anywhere. Take, for example, a wicked act of will. If its wrongness does not lie in its own character, but only in its cause, then it is not our fault unless it comes from a prior wrongful choice. But if we trace the blame to that prior cause, we must ask, does its blameworthiness come from its own nature? No, by this logic, only if it arises from another fault in us. And when we reach this next step, the same reasoning applies. Even if this next cause is bad in itself, we are not to blame for it unless it, too, arises from a prior fault, and so on, driving the notion of fault ever backward, never finding its resting place, until at last fault is banished altogether from the world, denied any true existence. Under this reasoning, vice or moral evil could never exist in any effect, because moral fault would not consist in the nature of anything, but always in its cause. But every effect is necessarily linked to its cause, therefore, only the cause could ever be blameworthy. Yet even here, blame could not rest, for in order to be blameworthy, the cause itself must have a further cause, otherwise, its fault would rest in its own nature, which this theory denies. But if this ultimate cause has no cause, then its faultiness is simply in its own nature, contradicting the very principle we started with. Thus, anyone who insists that it is not the nature of habits or acts of will that makes them virtuous or faulty, but only their cause, must immediately contradict himself and, by pressing his argument, actually refute it. It is clear, then, that if we say effects are blameworthy or evil, not because of anything in their own nature, but only because they come from an evil cause, then we are really just assigning fault to the nature of the cause itself. That is, if a bad effect of the will is considered evil only because its cause is evil or has some inherent badness, and a good effect is good only because its cause is good in nature, then our reasoning inevitably circles back. In claiming that blame or praise does not rest in the act itself, but in its cause, we are, in truth, still making the nature of the thing the foundation of virtue and vice. Suppose someone tries to avoid this problem by saying, no, the fault of the cause is not that it is inherently evil, but that it itself is the result of some earlier bad cause. Even then, the argument falls apart, for the blame merely shifts to a previous cause. The immediate cause is acquitted, and all fault must be assigned to the higher cause, based again on its nature. So, once more, we locate blame in the character of the thing itself, not in its origin. If someone insists on climbing ever higher, step by step, until they arrive at a first cause, and declare that all fault ultimately rests there, then in the end, they are forced to admit that faultiness exists in the nature of that first cause itself, not in what caused it, since, by definition, it has no prior cause, no act of ours that determined it, no preceding fault within us. It stands alone, without any origin. Thus, when all is said and done, the argument collapses. However far a person tries to run, he cannot escape. The blameworthiness of an act must ultimately rest in its very nature, not merely in what brought it about. It is in harmony with the natural understanding of all people that moral evil, and the dislike, hatred, and every kind of condemnation it deserves, resides in the very deformity within certain dispositions of the heart and acts of the will themselves, not in the deformity of something else distinct from these acts, even if that other thing is their cause. To claim otherwise is absurd, for it would mean that something innocent and not itself evil could be considered truly wicked, simply because it produced something evil. This is a contradiction, for it would suggest that the thing which is actually morally evil and blameworthy is, in fact, innocent, while only its cause deserves the blame. To argue that vice is not found in the vicious act itself, but only in its cause, is to say that vice is not truly vice, but instead belongs to whatever brought it about. Admittedly, a cause can itself be blameworthy for producing vice. There may indeed be wickedness in the cause because it brings forth wickedness. But it would be contradictory to imagine that these two forms of wickedness are identical. The wicked act of the cause in producing evil is one sin, the wickedness that results is another. Therefore, the evil of the latter does not reside in the former, but stands apart from it. The blame of both rests in the evil character of each thing that is wicked. What makes sin hateful is precisely what makes it worthy of punishment, for punishment is the just expression of moral hatred. Likewise, the beauty of virtue is what makes it worthy of praise and reward, which are simply outward expressions of love and honor. The very thing that makes vice detestable is its own loathsome nature, the thing that makes virtue beautiful is its own inherent goodness. This inner beauty or deformity is found within the good or evil will itself, and not merely in what brought it about. By the universal sense of mankind, this is what makes a disposition worthy of praise or blame. If the cause or occasion that gives rise to an evil will is also wicked, say, a previous evil intention, then that, too, is a separate sin, deserving its own punishment in a distinct way. There is a true worthiness of blame in the very nature of an evil choice, not just in some previous act that brought it about. Otherwise, an evil will, as an effect, would be no more a moral evil than an illness or any natural misfortune that arises from a morally evil cause. Take, for example, the case of ingratitude. According to common sense, ingratitude is detestable and deserving of blame, not because it was brought about by something equally bad or even worse, but because it is, by its very nature, hateful. Its deformity is inherent in itself. Likewise, the love of virtue is beautiful and worthy of praise, not merely because it arose from something prior in us, for instance, that we chose to love virtue, or somehow managed to produce this affection in ourselves, but because such a disposition of heart is, in itself, truly good and noble. Suppose, for argument's sake, that we did choose to love virtue and brought about this love in ourselves. That very choice could only be praiseworthy if it contained in itself some quality of genuine goodness, such as actual love for virtue or another admirable inclination. If the choice is to be considered good at all, it must possess a good nature. If, however, we chose to love virtue without any actual love for virtue or any exercise of good intention, and if our choice did not express any real goodness, then by the natural understanding of all people, that choice could not be virtuous or worthy of praise, for it would lack any true moral worth. At this point, it is worth noting a statement made by a certain author who has recently attracted great attention in America. He writes, "Unnecessary holiness is no holiness." Adam could not have been originally created in righteousness and true holiness, for he must have chosen to be righteous before he could be righteous. Therefore, he must have existed, must have been created, and must have exercised thought and reflection before he could be righteous. The author expands on this idea further in other parts of his work. If these claims are accepted, it would follow that the first choice to be righteous is not, itself, a righteous choice, because it was not preceded by another choice for righteousness. For the author insists that choosing to be righteous must come before any true righteousness, and whatever comes after, as the effect of such a choice, cannot be righteousness or holiness, since effects are necessary and must result from their causes. Thus, he reasons, unnecessary holiness is no holiness. By this logic, neither the choice to be righteous, nor any effect that follows from that choice, nor anything existing apart from choice, could be considered righteousness or holiness. The result is that, under this way of thinking, righteousness and holiness are altogether excluded from the world, with no pathway left for them to ever enter. I believe the reason people have come to embrace this strange and inconsistent idea about internal inclinations and acts of will, that their moral goodness or evil does not lie in their very nature, but rather in their cause, is because of a very simple truth recognized by common sense. When it comes to outward actions and the visible movements of the body, their moral value does not reside in the actions themselves, for in and of themselves they have no moral quality at all. All the moral good or evil related to them is found in the inward dispositions and acts of will that produce them. Because we are so accustomed to making this judgment, without hesitation or question, about outward actions, which, in ordinary language, are what people mean by actions or deeds, it is easy, when we begin speaking about the will or inward inclinations under the same heading of actions, to carelessly assume the same standard applies to them. People fail to see the crucial difference between the two cases. Now, if someone objects and asks, shouldn't the cause matter, when deciding whether something is worthy of praise or blame? Is it really reasonable to say a person deserves praise or blame for something they did not cause, or of which they were not the author and had no part? To this I reply, words and phrases like being the cause, being the author, having a hand in, and the like, are often ambiguous. In common usage, they typically mean being the intentional, voluntary cause, that is, the cause through a prior act of choice. But it is absolutely certain that no one is the cause or author of the very first act of their own will in this sense. This is as sure as any truth could ever be. For nothing can exist before it exists, nor can there be any act of a certain kind before there is a first act of that kind, so there can be no choice before the first choice. If, on the other hand, we use the phrase being the author to mean not producing something by a prior choice, but rather being the immediate agent, the person who is actually acting in the moment of that choice, then, of course, common sense does require that people be the authors of their own acts of will if they are to be truly worthy of praise or blame for them. Common sense also says that, when it comes to outward actions, we must be their authors in the first sense, that is, they must come from our own will or choice, if we are to be rightly praised or blamed. But common sense does not teach that the same is necessary for acts of will themselves. This distinction will become even clearer as we proceed to the next section. Section 2. The falsehood and inconsistency of the metaphysical idea of action and agency commonly held by defenders of the Arminian doctrine of liberty, moral agency, and the like. A central pillar of the Arminian argument for their views on moral agency, virtue, and vice is their metaphysical concept of agency and action. They claim that unless the soul possesses the power to determine itself, it cannot truly act, if its choices are not caused by itself, but are instead stirred and determined by some outside influence, then those choices cannot be considered the soul's own acts. According to them, the soul cannot be active, but must be entirely passive, in any effects that happen to it by necessity rather than by its own free decision. Mr. Chubb bases his entire system of liberty, and all his arguments for it, on the premise that man is an agent and capable of action, a point which, in itself, is undoubtedly true. However, in his definition, self-determination is essential to the very idea of action. He concludes from this that it is impossible for a person to act and to be acted upon in the same matter, at the same time. He further insists that nothing can be considered an action if it is merely the result of another's action, and he strongly maintains that the idea of a necessary agent, one who is necessarily determined in their actions, is a clear contradiction. Yet, arguments of this kind are built on shaky ground, for they rest on definitions that men have simply assigned to words according to their own preference, especially when those definitions are abstract, inconsistent, and stray far from the original, plain meaning of the word as used in ordinary speech. The way Mr. Chubb and others define the word action is clearly unintelligible and self-contradictory. According to their view, an action is something that involves no passivity at all, that is, in their terms, it is not under the power or influence of any cause. This implies that a true action would have no cause and would not be an effect at all, since being an effect means being subject to the influence of its cause. Yet, they also claim that every action of the mind is the effect of its own determination, that is, of its own free and voluntary choice. So, by their account, action is always the effect of something prior, namely a previous choice, and in being an effect, the mind is necessarily passive with respect to that prior cause. Thus, we arrive at a contradiction. An action is always the effect of a prior choice, but if it is the effect of something else, it is passive, and therefore not truly an action. The mind, by this account, cannot be active and passive in the same respect at the same time. Furthermore, they claim that necessity is completely incompatible with action, and that the phrase necessary action is a contradiction in terms. So, according to them, action must be contingent and never necessary. It cannot be essentially connected to anything prior, since such a connection would involve necessity and rule out contingency. Yet at the same time, they assert that every true action must be determined by the will and free choice, which is to say, it must be necessary, for it depends on and is determined by something prior, a previous act of choice. Again, they assert that a genuine action is the true beginning of motion or the exercise of power. But, in their account, it is not the beginning, but the result of a prior exertion of power, the power of the will and choice, for they say that no act is truly an action unless it is freely chosen, or, in other words, determined by a preceding free choice. If, however, Anyone denies this and says that not every action is determined by a previous choice, but that the first act of will, undetermined by any prior act, is the true action, then such a view again implies necessity. For whatever the mind experiences without being able to determine it by a previous choice, it undergoes necessarily, having no ability to prevent it by any act of its own will, since, by definition, there is no prior act of choice that could prevent it. So, in this alternate account, their notion of action is again both necessary and not necessary at once. Additionally, in their view, a genuine act cannot be the result of any prior bias or tendency, but must spring out of pure indifference, yet this means it cannot come from any prior choice, which itself would be a prior inclination or preponderance. Whether this bias is habitual or arises in the moment, if it causes the act, it is a real, prior, effective determination. Yet at the same time, they insist that a true act is something the agent authors freely and voluntarily, that is, by previous choice and intention. Thus, according to their conception of what an act is, especially when you consider all its supposed consequences, the following absurdities are all considered essential. An act must be both necessary and not necessary. It must arise from a cause, and yet from no cause at all. It must be the result of choice and design, and yet not the result of choice and design. It must be the beginning of motion or exertion, and yet also the outcome of a previous exertion. It must come before itself. It must spring immediately out of perfect indifference and equilibrium, and yet be the effect of some prior preponderance. It must originate from itself, yet also have its origin in something else. It must be what the mind produces of its own will and can bring about or prevent as it chooses, and yet also be something the mind has no power to prevent, since all previous choice is ruled out. So, under this metaphysical notion, an act is ultimately something about which no one can have any clear idea. It is nothing more than a confusion created by words, without any distinct meaning at all. In truth, it is an absolute nonentity in two ways. 1. There never has been, is not, and never could be, anything in all reality that matches the description of what they claim is essential to such an act. And 2. There neither is, nor ever has been, nor ever could be, any actual idea or conception in the mind that fits the word as they define and explain it. If we were to imagine such a notion, it would collapse in on itself by its very nature. It is impossible for a concept to exist whose essence, by definition, destroys itself. To illustrate, if some learned philosopher, returning from his travels, were to declare that in Terra del Fuego he discovered an animal, one that, as he describes, begets and gives birth to itself, yet also has parents distinct from itself, that hungers before it even exists, whose master both rules and is ruled by it, being driven wherever the animal pleases, that, in walking, always takes a step before its first step, that moves with its head first and yet always goes tail first, even though it has neither head nor tail, it would be perfectly reasonable to tell this philosopher, no matter how scholarly, that he has no real notion or idea of such a creature, nor ever has had, nor ever will. Not only is this previously described notion of action thoroughly inconsistent, it also departs entirely from the original meaning of the word. In common usage, action most often means a motion or exertion of power that is voluntary, that is, an effect of the will, and is generally used in the same sense as doing. Most often, it refers to outward deeds. For example, people typically distinguish between thinking and acting, or between desiring and willing on the one hand, and doing on the other. Beyond this usual and proper meaning, there are other, less precise ways in which action is used in everyday language. Frequently, it is applied to the movement or change found in inanimate objects, in relation to their effect on something else. For instance, we say that the spring of a watch acts upon the chain and wheels, or that sunlight acts upon plants and trees, or that fire acts upon wood. Sometimes, action is used to describe movements or changes in material things considered by themselves, especially when these motions appear to arise from some hidden internal source. In these cases, such movements seem more like the motions of our own bodies that follow from natural volition or unseen acts of will. Thus, we speak of the fermentation of liquor, the influence of a magnet, or the effects of electricity as actions of those substances. On occasion, action is also used to refer to the exercise of thought, will, or inclination. Meditating, loving, hating, being inclined or disinclined, choosing, or refusing may sometimes be called acts. Yet this is much less common, unless we are dealing with philosophers or metaphysicians, than the other senses described above. But in ordinary language, the word action is never used in the peculiar sense that Arminian theologians give it, namely, as a self-determined exercise of the will, or an exertion of the soul that arises without any necessary connection to anything prior. If a man does something voluntarily, or as the result of his own choice, then, according to the true, original, and most common use of the word, he is rightly said to act. But whether that choice or volition was self-determined, or not, whether it was connected to previous habits or biases, whether it was certainly the result of the strongest motive, or of some inward cause, none of this is ever considered in the meaning of the word. If some people choose to use the word action differently, to serve a particular theory of metaphysics or morality, no reasonable argument can be built on such an arbitrary use of language. To argue, as some divines and philosophers do, as though such a usage could support or demonstrate an entire system of moral philosophy and theology, is to build a grand structure on shifting sand, or, more truly, on a mere shadow. Even if it has become customary among them to use the word in this way, if such self-contradictory usage can even be called a meaning, this does not mean it matches the natural understanding that people have, or that anything in reality could ever fit such a definition. Though they may appeal to experience, the truth is, people do not and cannot experience such a thing. It is impossible for anyone even to form a conception of it. If someone objects that action and passion are clearly opposite terms, and that saying the agent, in its action, is under the influence of something else is to confuse these two and make them the same. I reply that, while action and passion do often have opposite meanings, they do not refer to opposite realities, but to opposite relations. Words like cause and effect are also opposites, yet we rightly say that the same thing may, in different respects, be both cause and effect at the same time. Likewise, the soul may be active in one regard, and passive in another, even in the same instance. The word passion, when used in contrast with action or activeness, does not signify an actual substance or event, rather, it denotes being passive, that is, being acted upon by some power or force exerted by a cause, producing an effect. This is simply a way of describing a relationship, not a separate thing in itself. Similarly, when action is used in opposition to passion, it does not refer to a real existence, but to the relation of activeness, a power or force directed toward another thing, which is then the subject of that action. Of course, the word action is often used in a more absolute sense, to mean a real event or movement, such as when we speak of an action not as something relative, but as a movement or exercise of the body or mind without reference to anything else. In this absolute sense, action is not properly the opposite of passion, which never signifies something absolute, but only the relation of being acted upon. Therefore, when action is used in a relative sense, action and passion simply describe two contrary relationships. There is nothing absurd in saying that a single thing can have contrary relations at the same time, with respect to different things. So, if the soul acts by willing, moving itself, acting upon objects, producing effects, and these actions themselves are, in turn, the result of something else acting upon and influencing the soul, there is no confusion of action and passion. The terms remain true opposites. There is as real a distinction between acting and being caused to act, even when the soul is both in the same act of will, as there is between living and being made alive. It is not a contradiction to say that an action can be the effect of a cause other than the one acting, any more than it is to say that life may result from something other than the one living, just as a person's life may be caused by another. What has led people into this inconsistent idea about action, when applied to volition, namely, that it is essential to internal action that the agent be self-determined, and that the will itself be its own cause, likely arises from how people naturally think and speak about outward actions. In ordinary life, and in the most basic and proper sense of the word, actions are external. In these, people are self-directed and self-determined, and it is their will that moves their bodies and produces outward deeds. Unless these acts are done voluntarily, by choice, and determined by the will beforehand, they are not truly regarded as a person's own actions or doings. For this reason, some philosophers have unwittingly, yet very irrationally, applied the same logic to the will itself, insisting that even volition must be determined by the will, just as bodily motion is determined by a preceding act of will, without recognizing the contradiction this creates. It is clear that in the philosophical distinction between action and passion, even though this distinction has long been widely accepted, there has not been careful attention paid to using language that actually matches reality or distinct, clear ideas. This problem is found in countless other philosophical and metaphysical terms used in these debates, resulting in endless difficulty, disagreement, error, and confusion. Thus, it probably came to be assumed that necessity is incompatible with action, at least as these terms are applied to volition. The confusion begins when action and necessity are shifted from their original meanings, where they refer to outward voluntary acts and external compulsion, two ideas that clearly do not go together, and are instead made to stand for quite different things: the act of will itself, and the certainty of its occurrence. When this shift in meaning is made, people often fail to adjust for the difference, and mistakenly attribute to action and necessity, in their new sense, the very same qualities they had in the original sense. On this mistaken basis, maxims are put forth and widely accepted as if they were the firmest truths and the clearest dictates of reason, when in reality they rest on nothing at all. Yet, no matter how vigorously some insist that what is necessary cannot truly be called action, and that a necessary action is a contradiction in terms, I doubt there are many Arminian theologians who, if pressed to be consistent, would truly hold to these principles. For they readily acknowledge that God is, in the highest and most perfect sense, an active being, the supreme source of life and all activity. They would hardly deny that what Scripture calls God's acts of righteousness, holiness, and faithfulness are truly and properly His own acts, and that God is a genuinely holy agent in all of them. And yet, I am certain they would not deny that God necessarily acts justly and faithfully, and that it is impossible for Him ever to act unrighteously or unholy. Section 3. The reasons why some consider it contrary to common sense to suppose that things which are necessary can be worthy of either praise or blame. Arminian writers often insist, and repeatedly emphasize, that it is contrary to common sense, and to the natural instincts and understanding of humanity, to suppose that necessity, without distinguishing between natural and moral necessity, is compatible with virtue or vice, praise or blame, reward or punishment. They have taken great pride in this line of argument, and it has proven troubling to many who wish to uphold the truth as clearly taught in Scripture. For such persons, it has often seemed genuinely difficult to reconcile Calvinistic doctrine with the ideas of justice and fairness that people typically hold. The real reasons for this difficulty appear to be as follows. First, it is an obvious and undeniable judgment of common sense that natural necessity is completely at odds with just praise or blame. If people do things that are in themselves very good, right, and desirable, but do them wholly against their will, and cannot help it, or do them out of a necessity wholly outside their will, without their will being involved in any way, then clearly, by common sense, their actions cannot be called virtuous, nor can they be considered morally good. Such people are not deserving of reward or praise, nor should they be esteemed, honored, or loved for those acts. On the other hand, if under a similar necessity they do things which are harmful or destructive, but are compelled to do so, unable to help themselves, if it makes no difference whether they will it or not, and the action happens purely by necessity and not by their own will, then, again, it is a plain dictate of common sense that they are not at all to blame. There is no vice or moral fault in the result, nor are such persons, who are thus compelled, in any way worthy of punishment, hatred, or even the slightest disapproval for what has occurred. In the same way, if something good or desirable is utterly impossible due to a natural impossibility, human reason universally agrees that this fact completely and entirely excuses a person for failing to do it. It is also a plain dictate of common sense that if doing what is good, or avoiding what is evil, is not absolutely impossible due to a natural impossibility, but is instead made very difficult by some natural difficulty, that is, a difficulty which exists apart from one's will or inclination, and would be the same regardless of one's desires, then a person's neglect or failure is partially, though not entirely, excused. In such a case, the fault is less serious than if the task had been easy. Furthermore, if instead of difficulty or hindrance there is, in the very nature of things, a natural tendency toward the good act or outcome, apart from any consideration of a person's heart or will, then, even if this tendency is not so great as to make the act necessary, but still provides a significant push in that direction, so that the act results mostly from this natural propensity and only a little from genuine good inclination, then common sense says there is less true virtue in the act, and it is correspondingly less praiseworthy or deserving of reward. The reason is simple. Such a natural propensity or tendency is a step toward natural necessity, and the greater the propensity, the closer one comes to necessity. Since natural necessity cancels out all moral virtue, a strong natural tendency moves in the same direction and therefore reduces the virtue of an act. On the other hand, natural difficulty in the circumstances is a step toward natural impossibility. And just as complete and absolute impossibility entirely removes blame, so natural difficulty partially removes or lessens blame, making the failure to act less worthy of punishment. 2. When people first use phrases like must, cannot help it, cannot avoid it, necessary, unable, impossible, unavoidable, or irresistible, they do so to describe a necessity of constraint or restraint, a kind of natural necessity or impossibility in which the will has no involvement. This necessity is present whether a person wants it or not, and remains unchanged regardless of anyone's desires or inclinations. Such terms, in their original and natural use across all nations, are relative. They carry within them the idea of something contrary to a person's will, desire, or effort. People learn from their earliest years that there are countless things they wish to do but cannot, and countless things they dread but must endure, things that happen no matter how strongly they may desire otherwise. It is this sort of necessity, so common and so keenly felt from childhood onward, that gives rise to these words and phrases. These are the realities for which the terms are first invented and most frequently used in everyday life, not to express some abstract, speculative, or philosophical idea of necessity, such as the logical connection between the subject and predicate of a proposition, which underlies the certainty of that proposition's truth. Philosophers, needing words for their metaphysical discussions about the origins and relationships of things, have borrowed these everyday terms for lack of anything more fitting. But from infancy, we grow up using these terms in a way very different from this philosophical meaning, a way that is deeply woven into our habits, so that their sense, as we first learn and constantly use them, is entirely unlike how they are used in debates between Arminians and Calvinists. And because, as noted earlier, it is the universal sense of mankind that the necessity expressed by these terms in their original, familiar meaning always excuses a person and frees them from blame, our notion of being excused or blameless becomes firmly attached to these words by habit. This association begins in early childhood, strengthens as we grow, and becomes deeply rooted by long use and custom. The habitual connection in people's minds between the idea of being blameless and words like must, cannot, unable, necessary, impossible, unavoidable, and similar terms becomes extremely strong. This is because, from the moment children first learn to reason and speak, they encounter countless situations where they need to excuse themselves due to some natural necessity expressed by these words: I cannot do it, I couldn't help it. Throughout life, everyone constantly finds reasons to use such phrases, both to excuse themselves and others, in nearly every area of life, when things go wrong, when misfortunes or disappointments arise, or when something good is missed, whether for ourselves or others. The strength of these habitual associations, formed from earliest childhood, can feel as if they are ingrained in our very nature. This is evident in countless other examples. For instance, it is entirely because of such habitual connections of ideas that people judge the size or distance of things they see. A person judges a distant mountain to be larger than his nose, or farther away than the tip of it, because from his earliest days he has learned to associate a certain visual appearance with great size or distance. People often assume this is simply the natural sense of sight. Yet, someone whose eyes had just been opened after a lifetime of blindness would not immediately make these judgments, even though the visual image is the same. In truth, what people mistake for natural sense is actually a habit formed by constant association. 3. When people, having grown accustomed from childhood to associate ideas of innocence or blamelessness with words like must, cannot, necessary, and the like, so much so that this connection seems almost natural, later encounter these same terms used in a new, metaphysical sense, to refer to a different kind of necessity, which does not involve any contrary will or effort. The impression of clear blamelessness is unconsciously and powerfully transferred to a context where it does not rightly belong. The shift in meaning is rarely noticed or considered, and several factors contribute to this oversight. 1. The terms, as philosophers use them, are often imprecise and unclear. Few thinkers use such words in a fixed or definite way. Instead, their meaning is usually vague and confused, something that often happens with words meant to describe intellectual or moral ideas, or what Locke called mixed modes. If people had a clear and distinct grasp of what these metaphysical terms actually meant, they would be better able to compare them with their original, everyday meaning. As a result, they would be less likely to be misled or confused by such language than by any other sort of words. 2. The transition in meaning is all the more subtle because, though the things signified are in fact very different, they do have some general features in common. In necessity, as people commonly use the term, there is a strong connection between what is said to be necessary and something prior to it in the order of nature. The same is true in philosophical necessity. And while, in both cases, the connection is not defined by its relation to an opposing will or effort, as it is in ordinary necessity, in both cases the connection is prior to will and effort, and so, in some sense, is above or independent of them. In both forms of necessity, there is a basis for certainty about the outcome. Because the same words are used, and because the two kinds of necessity share these and other broad features, and because philosophical use of the terms is poorly defined and vague, people often fail to recognize how different the two concepts actually are. The notions of innocence or fault, so deeply associated with these terms and united with them in the mind from earliest memory, remain attached even in the new context, as though this union were natural and unbreakable. Anyone who tries to separate them seems, in the eyes of many, to be doing violence to nature itself. 4. Another reason why people find it hard to accept that anyone should be blamed for something that happens by moral necessity, which, as previously noted, is a kind of philosophical necessity, is that, without careful reflection, they tend to assume this necessity could actually oppose a person's own will and sincere efforts. They imagine that a person might genuinely will, wish, and strive for things to be different, but that an invincible necessity prevents it. Many even feel this way about themselves. Some who live wicked lives suppose they wish they were good, that they loved God and holiness, but they do not see these wishes result in true change. The reasons for this confusion are as follows. 1. People sometimes experience what could be called an indirect willingness to have a better will, as described earlier. It is impossible, a contradiction, for the will to be directly and truly against itself. Yet, many fail to see that this indirect kind of willingness is entirely different from truly willing the virtue or duty required, and that there is no virtue in such a wish. They do not realize that when a wicked person has desires to love God, these are not genuine acts of will against the moral evil of not loving God, rather, they are only reactions against certain unpleasant consequences. Making this necessary distinction requires more thoughtful self-examination than most people are used to. Also, because of a natural bias in their own favor, people tend to think well of their desires and dispositions, and count them as virtuous, even though their supposed regard for virtue is only indirect and distant, and not the true source or object of their inclinations. 2. Another reason people are easily misled into thinking that moral necessity might oppose their own will and sincere effort is the way the terms themselves are derived and used. Words like unable, unavoidable, impossible, and irresistible seem to point directly toward some supposed power, exertion, or resistance that is frustrated by necessity. When people hear these words, they instinctively assume they are used in their normal sense, not realizing the difference. As a result, it naturally, and almost inevitably, occurs to them that it might be the case that someone's true desires and efforts could exist, yet an invincible necessity would stand in the way and make all efforts vain. 5. Another factor that makes people more inclined to believe it is unreasonable for men to be liable to the punishments threatened for sin, when their actions are morally necessary, or when they fail to do what is morally impossible, is the powerful effect of imagination. Imagination greatly amplifies the force of the apparent argument against such punishment, especially when the punishment is severe. If the issue were only whether someone deserved a minor punishment, it would not seem as hard to accept. Yet, if there truly were a sound argument, if reason itself dictated that necessity is incompatible with guilt or just punishment, the demonstration would be just as strong for a small penalty as for a great one. But imagination does not respond equally to both. Those who protest the justice of condemning people for what is necessary often make their case seem stronger by vividly describing the severity of the punishment, that a man should be thrown into eternal flames, that he should be made to burn in hell forever, for things he had no power to avoid, and was under a fatal, irresistible, invincible necessity to commit. Section 4. It is in harmony with common sense and the natural understanding of mankind to regard moral necessity as consistent with praise and blame, reward and punishment. Whether or not the reasons given above seem convincing to everyone, whether some still find it hard to reconcile with common sense the idea of praising or blaming, rewarding or punishing actions that are morally necessary, it is, nevertheless, unmistakably clear from what follows that, if we put aside all confusion caused by vague or misleading terms, this principle is not at all inconsistent with the natural understanding of mankind. In fact, it aligns perfectly with the sense of things found everywhere among ordinary people, who are least affected by the distortions that come from philosophical speculation and metaphysical subtleties. Rather, it is fully in accord with, and is truly the voice and judgment of, that basic and natural common sense. 1. This becomes clear when we reflect on what people generally mean by blameworthiness. The idea that common people, in every age and nation, have of being at fault or deserving blame is simply this: a person is at fault when he does wrong of his own will and desire. This includes two things. First, that he does wrong when acting according to his own pleasure, and second, that his very pleasure or desire itself is wrong. Or, to put it even more plainly, their idea is that a person's heart is wrong, and that he does wrong because his heart is in the wrong place. This, for them, is the whole matter. Ordinary people do not climb up the ladder of reflection and abstraction, searching out metaphysical sources, relationships, and dependencies in order to form their ideas of fault or blame. They do not wait until they have settled, through subtle reasoning, what it is that first determines the will, whether that determination comes from something outside or inside themselves, whether one volition determines another, whether the understanding governs the will, whether there is any real meaning in what philosophers call contingents, or whether there is some mysterious, inexplicable sovereignty in the will, by which it brings about all its own sovereign acts. None of these complex questions shapes their idea of blameworthiness. If it did, then the vast majority of people, indeed, nearly all humanity, would live and die without ever having any notion of fault or blame, and the idea that anyone could deserve praise or blame would scarcely ever arise in anyone's mind. Certainly, it would take ages before anyone had such a concept. But clearly, the sense of praise and blame is among the very first notions to appear in children, who show, as soon as they can think, speak, or act at all as rational creatures, a sense of what people deserve. And it is obvious that, in forming this idea, children do not use metaphysics. Their understanding rests simply on two things: experience, and an inborn sense, a certain fitness or appropriateness they feel, of connecting moral evil, as previously described, being or doing wrong by one's own will, with the resentment or disapproval of others, and with pain or punishment falling upon the wrongdoer. This natural sense is what we call conscience. It is true that ordinary people and children, when they consider whether an action or deed is blameworthy, assume that it is the person's own act. But for them, that simply means it is something the person did by choice. The idea that some exercise or motion must begin by itself is not part of their understanding of action or doing. If it were, then their idea would include that an action causes its own beginning, which would mean it exists before it comes into being, an obvious contradiction. Nor do they think of action as something that begins accidentally, without any cause or reason. That would go against one of the most basic dictates of common sense, that everything which comes into existence has some cause or reason why it is. When ordinary people judge an act to be blameworthy or praiseworthy, they do assume that the person acted with liberty. But by liberty, they simply mean that a person has the opportunity to do as he pleases. They have no concept of liberty as the will's first movement, where the will causes its own acts, determines its own determinations, or chooses its own choices. That is a kind of liberty only imagined by those whose thinking has been clouded by confusing metaphysical speculation and obscure, ambiguous language. According to common understanding, if a person is not prevented from acting as he wishes, or forced to act otherwise, he has liberty, without any need for the strange idea that a man's free will must be the cause of its own decisions. Nor do ordinary people have any notion of freedom as indifference. If they did, it would follow that the more indifferent someone is when acting, the freer he is, when, in reality, the opposite is true. According to common sense, a person acts with the greatest freedom when he acts with the strongest inclination. Far from thinking that indifference is necessary for praise or blame, the universal judgment of human nature is this: the less indifferent someone is when doing good or evil, and the more he acts from a full and strong inclination, the more he is esteemed or condemned, praised or blamed. 2. If it were truly against common sense to praise or blame a person for their choices in cases of moral necessity or impossibility, then it would follow that, according to the same common sense, the closer a case comes to such moral necessity, whether because of a strong prior tendency toward good or an overwhelming difficulty in doing good, the less praiseworthy or blameworthy a person would be. In other words, acts done with a powerful prior inclination would deserve less praise, and failing to do something due to great difficulty would deserve less blame. This is exactly how people judge cases of natural necessity or impossibility. As everyone recognizes, natural necessity or impossibility entirely removes praise or blame, and the closer one gets to these conditions, through natural propensity or difficulty, praise and blame are reduced in proportion. If common sense truly taught that moral necessity, or the impossibility of doing otherwise, eliminated all praise and blame just as natural necessity does, then by the same logic, an approach to moral necessity or impossibility would also proportionally reduce praise and blame, just as in natural cases. According to common sense, people are partly excused for neglecting what is difficult against their will, just as they are wholly excused for not doing what is impossible. If it made no difference whether the impossibility was natural, contrary to one's will, or moral, residing in the will itself, then the same would be true for difficulties and tendencies leading up to necessity. But in reality, the exact opposite is true. If a person's good actions arise from a strong moral inclination, a powerful love for virtue, common sense does not regard that person as less virtuous or less worthy of praise. On the contrary, everyone sees such a person as more virtuous, more admirable, and more deserving of honor. The stronger the inclination, the closer it comes to necessity or to being incapable of doing otherwise than the good, the more people esteem and praise such a person. Conversely, if someone's evil actions come from a deeply rooted habit or a violent tendency toward vice, if pride or malice flows from a settled, powerful disposition, ordinary judgment does not see such a person as less blameworthy, but as even more to be condemned and detested by all who witness it. It is also clear that, in the common understanding, a blameworthy or praiseworthy act of the will is not thought to be one that is determined purely by the sovereign power of the will itself, apart from any previous bias or motive. If that were the case, then the more a person's actions were influenced by motives or inclinations, the less virtuous or vicious they would be considered, and the less influence motives had, the more virtuous or vicious the action would be. But in reality, the opposite is true. People do not think a good act is less praiseworthy because the agent is strongly moved by a good motive or inclination, but rather, they see it as even more commendable. If a good inclination or motive has little influence in determining the act, they regard the act as less, not more, virtuous. The same reasoning applies to evil acts that are shaped by evil motives or inclinations. In fact, even if it is assumed that good or evil dispositions are part of a person's natural character, which is certainly what people commonly assume in many situations, this does not lead them to think that people deserve no praise or blame for such dispositions. After all, what is natural is, by definition, necessary, since nature precedes all acts of the will. For example, if a person is known for being proud or malicious by natural temperament, common sense does not conclude that these are not vices or moral evils, or that such a person does not deserve contempt or dishonor, or that his proud or malicious acts, which flow from his nature, are unworthy of resentment. In fact, when someone's evil disposition is thought to be deeply rooted in their nature, this is usually cited as an aggravation of their wrongdoing, not an excuse. People often say in anger, "That's just how he is. He has a vile nature. It's as natural for him to act this way as it is to breathe. He can't help serving evil." Yet, this is not how people respond when it comes to harmful things that happen by natural necessity against a person's will or inclination. In such cases, the necessity is universally recognized as a full excuse. It is, then, obvious that common sense makes a profound distinction between these two kinds of necessity, especially in how they affect moral judgment and desert. These judgments and instincts of the human mind are so deeply rooted and natural that it is doubtful whether even Arminians themselves ever truly escape them. Indeed, even their leading scholars, those who have pressed their metaphysical views of liberty furthest, and who believe they have constructed airtight arguments denying any compatibility between virtue or vice and necessity, can hardly act otherwise. It is questionable whether a single one of them, if he were to suffer great harm from the actions of someone gripped by an uncontrollable spirit of pride and malice, would not feel a far different resentment than if he suffered equally from the wind that blows or the fire that burns by natural necessity, or even then if he suffered the same at the hands of a person who was completely insane, even if that insanity had, in some way, resulted from his own fault. Some dismiss the distinction we make between natural and moral necessity, as though it had no bearing on this debate. Whatever is necessary, they say, is simply necessary. It must happen and cannot be prevented. Whatever is impossible, cannot be done, so no one can be blamed for not doing it. To support this, they use analogies, commanding a man without legs to walk and then punishing him for not doing so, or inviting a man locked in a strong prison to come forth, and then condemning him for failing. But in these things, Arminians are being profoundly unreasonable. Let common sense itself judge whether there is not a vast difference between these two situations. Imagine the first case. A man has offended his king and is thrown into prison. After some time, the king comes to him, calls him to come out, and promises that if he will humble himself and ask for pardon, he will be forgiven, released, enriched, and honored. The prisoner is truly sorry, ready to humble himself, and sincerely wants to accept the king's offer, but he is held by thick walls and iron bars. Now, consider the second case, a man of proud, ungrateful, stubborn spirit, raised in treason, whose heart burns with deep, persistent hatred for his rightful king. He is imprisoned for his rebellion and long endures chains and hardship. At last, the merciful king enters, orders the chains broken and the doors thrown open, and offers him pardon and high honor, if only he will come, admit his guilt, and seek forgiveness. But the man's pride and malice so dominate him that he cannot even will to accept. His heart is so bound by its own evil that it overpowers every generous offer. Now, is it really common sense to insist that there is no difference between these two cases, simply because, in both, there is some kind of necessity and the required act is impossible? It is true, a man's evil disposition can be as strong and immovable as prison bars. But who cannot see that, In the second case, saying the man cannot obey is a different use of the word. In ordinary speech, it is proper to say the rebel could come out of prison. He is free to do so if he wishes. Yet, because of the deep depravity of his heart, it is impossible that he should ever wish it. The impossibility here lies not in external constraint, but in the bondage of the will itself. All things considered, I believe that any person of sound judgment, who honestly reflects on what has been discussed, will admit that it is not clear from the dictates of common sense, or from the natural understanding of humanity, that moral necessity is inconsistent with praise and blame. If the Arminians wish to prove such an inconsistency, they must do so by means of philosophical or metaphysical arguments, not by appealing to common sense. There is a profound illusion in the supposed demonstrations Arminians draw from common sense. The real force of their arguments rests upon a prejudice that comes from an unnoticed shift in the meaning and use of words like liberty, able, unable, necessary, impossible, unavoidable, invincible, action, and so forth. These words have been moved from their original, ordinary meaning to a metaphysical sense that is entirely different. At the same time, the idea of blamelessness and similar concepts has become closely bound to these terms by habits formed when the words were still used in their original sense. This subtle confusion and prejudice form the very foundation of all the maxims by which Arminians interpret most of the scriptures they cite in this debate, and upon which all their impressive arguments from scripture and reason are built. This hidden mistake is the real source of their supposed strength. It is the core of their defenses and the sharpness of their weapons. On this basis, they feel justified in treating others with a haughty spirit, deriding those who disagree as ignorant, superstitious, and irrational, enemies of common sense, upholding the most obvious absurdities. Yet, perhaps an honest examination of what has been set forth in the preceding sections will help truth seekers to see more clearly whose doctrine is truly self-contradictory, obscure, and contrary to common sense, and whose teaching actually violates the universal dictates of reason. Corollary. From what has been shown, it follows that it fully accords with common sense to believe that the freedom of glorified saints is in no way diminished. Indeed, they retain their liberty undiminished in every respect. Likewise, God himself possesses the highest possible freedom, in the truest and most proper sense of the word. He is, in the fullest possible way, an agent, supremely active in the exercise of his infinite holiness. Yet, he acts in these things with the utmost necessity, and these very actions are, in the highest and most perfect sense, virtuous and worthy of praise. In fact, they are so precisely because they are most perfectly necessary. Section 5. On the objections that this doctrine of necessity makes all means and efforts to avoid sin, or to attain virtue and holiness, useless and futile, and that it reduces men to nothing more than machines in matters of morality and religion. Arminians argue that if sin and virtue occur by necessity, that is, by a fixed chain of causes and effects, antecedents and consequence, then it can never be worthwhile to use any means or make any effort to pursue virtue or avoid sin, since no effort could possibly change what is already necessary by an established connection. But I ask that this point be weighed carefully and examined with the utmost rigor. Does it truly follow that all efforts and means to obtain or avoid some future thing must be more useless, given such a connection, than if things were otherwise? To say that efforts are in vain means that they do not succeed, that is, that they are not, in the end, the means by which the desired result is obtained. This can only happen in one of two ways. First, though the means are used, the desired outcome does not happen. Or second, if the outcome does occur, it is not due to the means, but happens regardless of whether the means are used or not, that is, there is no real connection or dependence of the outcome on the means. If either of these is true, then the means are indeed in vain. The success or failure of means in bringing about a result, or whether they are in vain or not, depends on whether the means and the effect are so connected that the effect comes about with the means, and not without them, or, in other words, the presence of the means results in the effect, and the absence of the means results in the absence of the effect. If such a connection exists, the means are not in vain. The stronger and more certain this connection, the less the means are in vain. The weaker the connection, the more vain the means. Therefore, the real question to answer, if we are to judge whether this doctrine of necessary connection makes our use of means or efforts more vain, is this: does such necessity result in less of a connection between means and their effects? In other words, does supposing a real, fixed link between means and outcome actually make them less connected than if there were no fixed connection between anything that comes before and anything that follows? The very phrasing of this question exposes the absurdity of saying so. Anyone with open eyes can see that this is self-contradictory. Means are things that come before, effects are what come after. If there were no connection between what comes before and what comes after, then there could be no connection between means and their ends at all, and so all means would be utterly useless and ineffective. It is only by the reality of such a connection that means ever achieve anything. In fact, it is precisely because we have seen, learned, or been shown that certain causes lead to certain effects, that we can ever choose one means above another. If there were no established connection, there would be no such thing as choosing means, for nothing would be more likely to produce any effect than anything else. There would be no tendency or causal link at all. Everything that works as a means does so only because it is a connected antecedent to its result. To claim, then, that a fixed connection between causes and effects makes means futile or hinders the connection between means and their results is as absurd as saying that a connection between antecedents and consequents somehow gets in the way of there being a connection between antecedents and consequents. Nor does any supposed connection in the sequence of antecedents and consequents, extending all the way back to the very beginning of all things, whether that connection is established by the laws of nature, or by those laws combined with God's sovereign and direct interventions, or by any other means, if any such there be, in any way prevent our efforts from being part of that sequence. In other words, the means we use may themselves be among those antecedents that, in the established order of things, are connected with the results we seek. The efforts we make are real things, therefore, they are part of the overall chain of events, each link of which is assumed to be connected to the next. So, our efforts must be connected to some outcome or another within that sequence. And nothing about this connection prevents the outcomes to which our efforts are joined from being precisely the outcomes we seek, outcomes we pursue because, by observation or by divine revelation, we judge them to be the most likely means to achieve our goals. For example, suppose there is a genuine and fixed connection between a man opening his eyes in daylight, with healthy organs of sight, and his ability to see, so that seeing is linked to opening his eyes, and not seeing is linked to not opening them. Suppose also that there is a similar connection between a man's attempt to open his eyes and his actually doing so. No matter how certain or necessary these connections may be, this does not mean it is useless for the man to try to open his eyes if he wishes to see. His intention and his action, the use of the means, are themselves results of his will, and they do not break the chain or prevent the connection from bringing about success. Therefore, the objection does not truly apply to the doctrine that events are necessary by a sure connection of cause and consequence. In fact, this objection, if it has any force, lands squarely against the Arminian doctrine of contingency and self-determination, which denies such connection. For if there is no connection between the events in which virtue and vice consist and anything that comes before them, then there is likewise no connection between these events and any means or efforts used to produce them. In that case, those means and efforts must be completely useless. The less connection there is between what comes before and what follows, the less connection there is between means and their intended end, between effort and success, and to that extent, means and efforts become fruitless and in vain. According to Arminian principles, there can be no real connection at all between virtue or vice and any preceding event or circumstance. In other words, whether virtue or vice comes to exist cannot depend in any degree on anything that comes before, since, if it did, it would not be a result of self-determination, and thus would not possess the nature of true virtue or vice. Consequently, virtue and vice would not be, in any degree, dependent upon or connected with any prior event, cause, or means. If that is the case, then all prior means and efforts are entirely without value. Therefore, within the Arminian framework, there can be no reasonable basis for even guessing that any means or efforts will have any influence, whether in escaping vice, attaining virtue, or in choosing one means above another as being more likely to succeed. This is true whether one thinks of success coming from a natural connection between means and ends, or from some divine ordinance or revealed method by which God brings about these results in response to means, efforts, prayers, or actions. The very idea of seeking guidance from God's promises presupposes that God himself is the giver or determining cause of these outcomes, but if everything ultimately depends on self-determination, then God is not the sovereign disposer of these events. And if he is not, then nothing he has revealed about his ways of giving virtue or preventing vice can guide us or allow us to make any reasonable judgment about the likelihood of success through any means. In fact, according to these principles, not only can a person have no good reason to hope that their means and efforts will succeed in gaining virtue or avoiding vice, they may be certain that their efforts will fail. They can be sure their striving will be in vain, and if, by chance, the thing they desire does come to pass, it will not be because of the means or efforts they used. Means and efforts can only bring about the result in one of two ways. 1. By a natural tendency or influence, shaping the heart more toward virtuous acts, either by strengthening the disposition to virtue, or by placing the mind in view of compelling motives and inducements, or 2. By putting someone in the path of God's gracious bestowal of the blessing. But under the Arminian view, neither way is possible. Not the latter, for as just shown, it is essential to their notion of self-determination, which they consider the foundation of virtue, that God not be the determining or disposing cause of virtue. Not the former, either, for a natural influence or tendency implies cause and effect, a necessary outcome, which contradicts Arminian liberty. For means to influence the heart toward virtue, or for motives to have power over the will's choices, would undermine the Arminian idea of liberty as pure indifference and sovereign self-determination, as has already been fully demonstrated. But to thoroughly dispel this prejudice against the doctrine of necessity, as if it encourages a total neglect of effort by making all endeavors seem futile, let us carefully consider the following. The question is not whether people might abuse this doctrine, indeed, many sound and wholesome doctrines are misused, but whether the doctrine itself gives any reasonable grounds for such abuse. Would it truly be rational, on the assumption that the doctrine is true, to act as if all effort is pointless? If anyone insists that the nature of the doctrine does provide grounds for such neglect, it must be based on this idea, that an unbreakable necessity, already established for all things, would make all our actions, efforts, plans, or means to obtain any future end, completely insignificant, since nothing we do could ever change the order or outcome of events, everything being irrevocably fixed by necessity. They conclude, then, that it is foolish to pursue any means for any end, and wise only to save themselves the trouble of effort, and simply take their ease. But no one can truly draw this inference and act on it without contradicting himself and undermining the very principle he claims to follow. For, in reaching this conclusion and adopting such a course, he is still seeking an end, his own comfort and the avoidance of trouble. He is using means to pursue something in the future, even in his determination to do nothing and to avoid all means. He seeks future rest and the supposed benefits of laziness. If necessity makes all our efforts in vain regarding any future outcome, it likewise makes our efforts in vain even in pursuit of future ease. The measure of our ease, with all its circumstances, is just as much determined by necessity as anything else. If a person reasons, whatever future happiness or misery I experience is already determined by the necessary order of things, so I'll spare myself the trouble of labor and diligence, since these cannot increase my happiness or decrease my misery. Instead, I'll enjoy the comfort of idleness. Such a man refutes his own position. He claims that all is fixed and that no effort is worthwhile, yet he concludes that he should avoid effort in order to secure future ease and happiness. In his very reasoning, he uses means, sloth and negligence, for a future goal, contradicting the conclusion that all means are in vain. Therefore, it is unreasonable for anyone to use the doctrine of necessity as a pretense for willfully neglecting the means to their own happiness. The very logic required to draw such a conclusion is inconsistent with actually putting it into practice, for to act on the doctrine, even to neglect effort because of it, means being influenced by it, making a conscious decision about one's own behavior with a particular end in mind. But as has been shown, this is incompatible with the principles supposedly motivating such conduct. In short, these principles cannot truly be lived out or acted upon consistently in any way. Every attempt to act on them is self-contradictory. As for the objection that this doctrine makes people nothing more than mere machines, I reply, even with this doctrine, humans are utterly and immeasurably different from machines. We possess reason and understanding, the faculty of will, and the capacity for volition and choice. Our wills are directed by our understanding, by the things we know and perceive. Our outward actions and much of our inner life are subject to our own will, so that we have genuine liberty to do what we desire. Because of this, we are capable of moral habits and acts, of inclinations and deeds that, in the judgment of all humanity, are worthy of praise, love, esteem, and reward, or, on the contrary, of disapproval, disgust, indignation, and punishment. This is all the difference there can be between us and mere machines concerning liberty and agency, all the dignity, excellence, and privilege that can be wished for, or even imagined. Indeed, this is the very extent of what Arminians themselves end up affirming, when pressed to clarify their position, though in clarifying, they contradict what they originally claimed to be explaining. For, in the end, they must explain self-determination as simply the power to choose as one wills, which is just to say that a person has the power to choose, and in many cases, to act as he chooses, a far cry from the contradiction of having the power to choose one's very first choice. If, however, their view implies any difference between men and machines beyond this, it is for the worse. It actually strips away dignity and privilege. While machines are governed by an intelligent cause, by the careful hand of their maker or master, the Arminian view leaves the will of man at the mercy of sheer, blind chance. Section 6. On the objection that the doctrine here defended aligns with the Stoic doctrine of fate and the teachings of Mr. Hobbes. When Calvinists challenged the Arminian idea of free will and the supposed contingency of volition, insisting that every act of the will, and indeed every event, occurs by some necessity, their opponents often accuse them of aligning with the fatalism of the ancient Stoics, or with Mr. Hobbes's philosophy of necessity. Were it not for the fact that some leading Arminian writers have pressed this objection, it would hardly be worth mentioning. Many important truths were upheld by the Greek and Roman philosophers, especially the Stoics, which lose none of their value for having been affirmed by them. In fact, by the general admission of Christian theologians, including Arminians, the Stoics were the greatest, wisest, and most virtuous among the pagan philosophers. Their teachings and conduct came closer to the truth of Christianity than any other pagan school. How often do even Arminian preachers quote Stoic sayings in their sermons, not as proof of error, but as confirmation of vital Christian doctrines, the unity and perfection of God, the reality of a future life, and the duty and happiness of mankind. Again and again, they cite the harmony between the wisest, best of the heathen and the gospel of Jesus Christ, as revealed by the light of nature and reason. It is striking to note that Dr. Whitby, for example, argues against us by pointing out where the Stoics agree with Calvinists, treating this as evidence against our views. Yet the same Dr. Whitby, when the Stoics agree with the Arminians, appeals to this as support for their doctrine, as if agreement with the Stoics is a mark of truth when it favors them, but a mark of error when it favors us. Thus, when the Stoics align with Arminian thought, it supposedly proves their doctrine is in harmony with natural sense and common reason, but when they align with Calvinist teaching, it is treated as a damning sign of heathenism. Some Calvinist writers have observed that, in several points opposed by Calvinists, the Arminians themselves actually agree with the Stoics. This is evident, for example, in their denial of original, innate, total corruption of the heart, and in their belief that man has the ability to make himself truly virtuous and like God, among other positions. In the end, it is no more a valid criticism of our doctrine that it agrees in some respects with the ancient Stoics, than it is of the Arminian doctrine that it agrees, in some points, with the views of the worst of the pagan philosophers, the followers of Epicurus, the father of atheism and moral license, or with the Sadducees and Jesuits. I am not especially concerned to know the precise details of what the ancient Stoic philosophers taught about fate, as though the surest path to truth were simply to avoid agreeing with them. It appears they were not even fully agreed among themselves, and likely, the doctrine of fate held by most Stoics contained significant errors. But whatever their particular views may have been, if any of them taught a doctrine of fate that denies all liberty, meaning, if it denies our ability to do as we choose, I categorically reject such a fate. If their view of fate was inconsistent with the universal and natural ideas people hold regarding liberty, activity, moral responsibility, virtue, and vice, I reject that view, and I believe I have demonstrated that my position is not subject to that criticism. If the Stoics meant by fate anything that could be thought to hinder or diminish the usefulness and value of means and efforts, or make it less reasonable for men to desire and pursue virtue and happiness, I reject any such position, and my doctrine suffers no more from this problem than any other view, and in fact far less than the Arminian scheme of mere contingency, as has already been shown. If the Stoics' fatalism is inconsistent with any kind of liberty that could be a real perfection, dignity, privilege, or advantage to any intelligent being, indeed, with any liberty that can even be imagined, I embrace no such doctrine. If, by fate, they meant anything contrary to the belief that the entire world is ruled and governed in all things by a supremely wise and intelligent agent, not as an impersonal world soul, but as the sovereign Lord of the universe, who governs everything by his own perfect will, choice, and design, exercising the highest conceivable liberty and subject to no constraint, and under the power of nothing before, above, or outside himself, I utterly repudiate any such teaching. As for the claim that my doctrine of necessity agrees with that of Mr. Hobbes, I openly admit that I have never read Hobbes's writings. Whatever his views may have been, we are under no obligation to reject any truth clearly established by evidence, simply because it was once affirmed by someone of questionable character. Even the glorious truth that Jesus is the Son of God was shouted repeatedly by the devil himself, yet this did not diminish its worth. If a truth is contaminated merely because it is declared by a wicked or malicious person, we would never be able to hold to any precious or self-evident doctrine with confidence. If Mr. Hobbes abused this truth for wicked ends, that is regrettable, but such abuse does not render the truth itself suspect or unworthy of acceptance. It is, in fact, a common feature of the sinful heart to misuse even the noblest things for evil purposes. Furthermore, it has been observed that the Arminians themselves actually agree with Mr. Hobbes in many more matters than do the Calvinists, such as his positions regarding original sin, his denial of the need for supernatural illumination, his rejection of infused grace, and his denial of justification by faith alone, among other points. Section 7. On the necessity of the divine will. Some may object to the claim that self-determination of the will is absurd and that, in every case, the will must be determined by some motive, a motive which, in the view of the understanding, is stronger than any opposing one. The objection runs like this: if this is true, then not only the wills of created beings, but even the will of God himself, must be necessary in all its determinations. Concerning this point, the author of the essay on the freedom of will in God and in the creature, pages 85, 86, protests, "What a strange doctrine this is, so contrary to all our ideas of God's dominion. Does it not strip God of the glory of his liberty of choice, and take from the Creator, Governor, and Benefactor of the world, this most free and sovereign agent, all the honor of such freedom? Does it not seem to reduce him to a kind of mechanical instrument of fate, introducing the doctrine of fatality and necessity, as taught by Mr. Hobbes, into everything God does? Does it not picture the blessed God as a being of immense understanding, power, and efficiency, but still without the ability to choose freely among all the objects before him? In short, it seems to make the blessed God a sort of almighty servant of fate, subject to its supreme and universal authority, just as some of the ancients taught that fate stood above even the gods. This is more a matter of rhetoric than of real argument, an appeal to the imagination and to prejudice, not to pure reason. Yet let us calmly examine whether there is any substance in this fearful portrayal. Before considering the matter in detail, it is important to acknowledge this: it is only reasonable to expect far greater difficulty in describing or conceiving things with metaphysical precision when it comes to the nature and manner of existence in the divine understanding and will, and in the operations of these faculties, if we may so call them, in the divine mind, than in the case of human minds. The human mind is infinitely closer to our comprehension, more suited to the limits of our understanding, and far more aligned with the common usage of language. Even with our own minds, our language is woefully inadequate for expressing the precise reality of their faculties and operations. Most words were originally created to describe external, physical things, and when they are applied to the inner, spiritual realities of thought and will, they are almost always metaphorical or analogical, and thus carry much ambiguity and vagueness. This inevitably brings about a host of doubts, difficulties, and confusion in any inquiry or debate about matters of this kind. And if our language is so limited in speaking of the human mind, it is even less suited to express the workings of the infinite, incomprehensible mind of God as they truly are. We find it exceedingly difficult to grasp the precise nature of our own souls. Despite all the progress achieved over the ages in understanding these things, and even though our metaphysical knowledge has become far more refined than it once was, there remains much yet to discover, and much ground for future inquiry and development, even across many generations to come. But to understand with true clarity, according to strict and perfect reality, the nature of God's being, or the modes by which the powers of the divine mind operate, would require us to be infinitely skilled metaphysicians. It is worth noting, in particular, that while we must conceive of some things in God as following after others, or depending on others, so that certain attributes of the divine nature and will serve as the foundation for others, being prior in the order of nature, we should recognize how limited such language is when applied to God. For example, we conceive of God's knowledge and holiness as coming before his happiness, or the perfection of his understanding as the basis for his wise purposes and decrees, or the holiness of his nature as the cause and reason of his holy choices. Yet, when we speak of cause and effect, before and after, foundation and dependence, or determination and what is determined, in relation to the first being, the self-existent, independent God, perfectly simple and unchanging, the ultimate cause of all, there is surely less accuracy in such descriptions than when these terms are applied to created, dependent beings who are composite and ever-changing. With these cautions in mind, I now turn to consider the author's dramatic outcry about the necessary determination of God's will in all things by what he perceives as wisest and best. The entire force of such objections and outcries rests on the assumption that there is some kind of advantage or dignity in not being subject to a moral necessity that makes it impossible to choose anything other than what is wisest and best, as though there were some sort of shame, inferiority, or bondage in being so constrained, a view that imagines the will to be confined and held captive, as if it were in the grip of an invincible power, bound with chains from which it could never escape. But this is nothing more than imagination and error. There is no disadvantage or dishonor in being necessarily determined to act in the most excellent and blessed way, by the very perfection of one's own nature. This does not imply any imperfection, inferiority, or dependence, nor any lack of dignity, privilege, or supremacy. It does not in any way contradict the absolute and perfect sovereignty of God. God's sovereignty means his ability and authority to do whatever he pleases, as Scripture says, he does according to his will in the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand, or say to him, "What are you doing?" The sovereignty of God includes these truths. 1. He possesses supreme, universal, and infinite power. God can do as he pleases, without any restriction or opposition. His power is never limited, never dependent on any other, nor derived from any outside source. Rather, all power in creation derives from him and depends wholly on him. 2. He has absolute and perfect authority. God's right to do as he wills is supreme. He is not subject to any higher authority, nor does he derive his right from another, nor is it limited by any independent rule. He is the source and head of all dominion. 3. His will is supreme and independent. In all things, God's will is determined by his own counsel, guided by nothing but his perfect wisdom. He is not constrained by any other will, but every other will is subject to his. 4. His wisdom, which directs his will, is supreme and self-sufficient. As the prophet Isaiah says, Isaiah 40:14, with whom did he take counsel, and who instructed him, and taught him in the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding. No other sovereignty but this is truly divine. This is absolute sovereignty. No other is desirable, honorable, or even conceivable. It is the glory and greatness of God's kingship that his will is always determined by his infinite and all-sufficient wisdom, and never by an inferior wisdom, nor by mere arbitrariness, never acting without reason, purpose, or end. If God's will is always and unerringly determined by supreme wisdom, then in every instance it must necessarily choose what is most wise and best. Surely, anything less would be a disadvantage and a dishonor. For if the divine will were not necessarily fixed on that which is wisest in every circumstance, it would then be exposed, to some extent, to aimless contingency, and therefore, just as much, to the possibility of evil. To suppose that the will of God could be tossed about at random, driven by the blind winds of chance, guided by no wisdom, no motive, no intelligent reason, if such a thing were even possible, would be to attribute to him a profound imperfection and indignity, infinitely beneath the majesty of God. If moral necessity in the divine will were truly a defect, then the greater one's freedom from it, the greater the honor, so that, in this view, the supreme glory would belong to that will which is wholly exempt from wisdom's direction, utterly surrendered to blind, purposeless contingency, and acting always at random. But such a state is not excellence, but utter deficiency. It is no more a mark of dependence for God's wise volitions to be necessary than it is for his very existence to be necessary. If it is too low for God to have his will governed by moral necessity, so that he always and unfailingly chooses what is supremely holy and blessed, then why should it not also be too low for his very existence, his infinite perfection, or his happiness to be necessary? Surely, it is no more dishonorable for God to be necessarily wise than to be necessarily holy. If neither necessity of wisdom nor of holiness is a dishonor to him, then it cannot be a dishonor to act both wisely and holily by necessity. And if it is not beneath God to be necessarily holy and wise in the highest degree, then it cannot be less honorable for him to act in perfect holiness and wisdom in every instance, or, in other words, to do at all times that which is supremely wisest and best. The reason it is not dishonorable to be necessarily most holy is that holiness, in itself, is excellent and worthy of honor. By the same token, there is no dishonor in being necessarily most wise, and in every case acting in the wisest manner possible, for wisdom is, by its very nature, honorable and excellent. The previously mentioned author of the essay on the freedom of will, as already noted, depicts the doctrine that God's will is always determined by supreme fitness as if it made the blessed God into an almighty servant or mere instrument of fate. He further argues, pages 93, 94, that this moral necessity and impossibility is essentially the same as physical or natural necessity and impossibility. On pages 54 and 55, he writes, "The scheme that always and certainly determines the will by the understanding, and the understanding by the appearance of things, seems to do away with the real nature of vice and virtue. For the highest virtues and the basest vices would seem to be nothing more than matters of fate and necessity, flowing naturally and inevitably from the mere existence, circumstances, and present situation of persons and things, for this existence and situation inevitably produce a certain appearance to the mind, From this appearance comes a necessary perception and judgment about these things. This judgment inevitably determines the will, and so, by this chain of necessary causes, virtue and vice would lose their true nature, and become mere natural states, necessary outcomes, rather than moral and free actions. Yet this very author concedes, see pages 30 to 31, that a perfectly wise being will always and certainly choose what is most fitting. He also admits, on pages 102 and 103, I grant, and always have granted, that wherever there is such an antecedent superior fitness of things, God acts according to it, never contradicting it, and, in particular, in all his judicial proceedings as governor and dispenser of rewards and punishments. Indeed, he expressly declares, page 42, that it is not possible for God to act otherwise than according to this fitness and goodness in things. Putting these statements together, we see that, according to this author, there can be no virtue, nor anything of a truly moral nature, in even the most sublime and glorious acts of God's holiness, justice, and faithfulness. According to his reasoning, God never does anything supremely worthy or excellent except as a sort of mechanical agent of fate. Even in his actions as judge and moral governor of the world, God would show no moral excellence, nor exercise true freedom, since he acts by a moral necessity which, he claims, is essentially the same as physical or natural necessity. Therefore, all of God's holy actions would be nothing more than hobbistical fatality. God would be a being indeed of vast understanding, as well as power and efficiency, but without a will to choose, being a kind of almighty administrator of fate, acting under its supreme influence. For this author admits that in all such things, God's will is invariably determined by a superior fitness, and that it is not possible for him to act otherwise. But if this is true, what glory or praise could ever be attributed to God for acting holily and justly, or for always choosing the wisest, most excellent course in any instance? Yet, according to Scripture and the universal sense of mankind, it is no dishonor at all for a being to act necessarily with supreme wisdom and holiness, because of the moral perfection of his nature. Rather, this is the very reason for his highest praise. In this necessity, his glory is most fully displayed. The same author, see page 56, argues that the true excellence of a wise and good man is seen in this, that though he is able to choose contrary to what is fitting, he does not. Instead, he submits to be guided by what is fit. In this way, the author claims, such a man imitates the blessed God. Yet he also asserts the very opposite about God himself, not that God simply allows himself to be guided by fitness when he could have chosen otherwise, but rather that it is not even possible for God to choose contrary to what is fitting. As the author states, page 42, it is not possible for God to act otherwise than according to this fitness, where there is any fitness or goodness in things. Indeed, he goes so far as to say, page 31, that if a man were perfectly wise and good, he could not act otherwise than by being constantly and certainly determined by the fitness of things. One more point should be made before concluding this section. If it does not diminish God's glory at all to be necessarily determined by supreme fitness in some things, then it cannot diminish his glory to be so determined in all things. There is nothing about the nature of such necessity that detracts from God's freedom, independence, absolute supremacy, or from any dignity or excellence in his character, position, or ways. This necessity does not imply weakness, restriction, or subjection in God. And if being necessarily determined by perfect wisdom and fitness is entirely compatible with his glory, if nothing about it lessens his majesty or freedom, then we need not fear attributing this necessity to God in every respect, as though doing so would somehow diminish his glory.